To the radio audience, we welcome you to the Institute of World Affairs George F. Kennan Forum on International Affairs. Our focus, the future of the United Nations. What is its role? What would happen if we didn't have a United Nations? What would happen if the United States decided it didn't want to be part of the United Nations? These questions and many others from me, our guests, and our audience will help us fill out 2 hours of education and introspection about the role of the UN and this world we live in. To help us get started, we are now going to welcome the mayor of Milwaukee, Tom Barrett. Mayor Barrett.
Thank you very much, Ben, and thank all of you for being here. This is truly one of the most exciting events that occurs each year in the city of Milwaukee, and the city of Milwaukee is proud to be continue to be a sponsor of this event. I personally think this is extremely, extremely important for our community. We are an international community, we are an international region, we are an international state, and it is important for us to have the type of dialogue that we are going to have today, because as Ben said, all politics is local, but when we're in a world economy, it is imperative that we know the ramifications of decisions that are made, whether in New York City at the United Nations, whether in Washington, D.C., what those decisions have, the impact those decisions have right here locally for us. I welcome all the visitors here, all those of you from Milwaukee. I know there are people here from Door County, from Dane County, from Waukesha County, and other parts of the state, and we welcome you here. I especially welcome the students who are here. You are the future of this community, you are the future of this state, you are the leaders that are really going to set the stage for us as we face these decisions that are decisions that really have monumental impact. So I'm pleased you're here. For those students, I actually, when I come to this event each year, I can't help but think back to when I was a student, because it was just about 30 years ago this month when I received a letter from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee telling me that I had been accepted in the UWM summer seminar at the United Nations. For a young guy who grew up in the city of Milwaukee and really had never been out of the city, that was my first opportunity to meet with other students from around the state, from around the country at the United Nations. And I can tell you that it changed my life forever. So for those students who are here, that program is still in existence. It is still a great program. It takes students from all over the state, and it's an opportunity, really, I think, to round out your education. So please take advantage of that program. We are blessed in our community to have George Kennan. Mike D'Amato, the alderman, did a great job in talking about his importance to the community, and it's really to the world community, because the work that he did on containment, the work he did on the Marshall Plan, his recognition of our limitations as a country, his work on our challenges as a country, I think has really set the standard for the last 50 years in public policy. Some would argue that perhaps that influence waned in the last 5 or 6 years, but I think that his intellect and his persuasive writings will linger for many, many years to come. And I certainly am proud as a mayor of this city to know that one of our favorite sons was George Kennan. So I would just like us to take a moment of silence to remember Mr. Kennan, since he died earlier this year. When I looked at the topic for today's conversation, the future of the United Nations, I thought, sounds like a Senate confirmation hearing to me, because I think as we look at the issues that are before us right now in Washington, in particular before the Senate, with the nomination of John Bolton to be our ambassador to the United Nations, there are some who argue that this is akin to Nixon going to China. There are others who argue this is akin to a fox with very sharp teeth on his way into the hen house. And I think it's going to be for the U.S. Senate and for the people of our country to decide that in the next few weeks or few months, whenever that decision is made. Whether you like his nomination or don't like his nomination, I think it's actually healthy for our country to have this debate. What is our relationship with the United Nations? What should our relationship be? I'm very much of the school of thought that the United Nations has some flaws. It has had problems, and we would be a much worse world if it did not exist. We need the United Nations. There's no doubt in my mind. And I can think back of the challenges that we had when I served in Congress, and they range from the very substantial about what countries should serve on the Security Council and what our role should be in various UN organizations to the ridiculous. Specifically, when there was problems with diplomats who did not pay their parking tickets around the UN building, and how we were to solve that problem, which we ultimately decided we would solve by simply lowering the amount of assistance that went to that country by the amount of those parking tickets. A very clever solution to a pretty thorny problem at the time, but one that I think worked out very, very well. But at the end of the day, we need to have the United Nations. We need to have the dialogue, not only between the United States and other countries, but throughout the world community. And at a time when the United States is asserting itself throughout the world, it is important for us to continue to hear those voices. So again, I welcome all of you here. I am delighted that you are here. I'm delighted that Gareth Evans and Gillian Sorensen are here to share their wisdom with us. And as the mayor of the city, I have to say that my only request, particularly for those of you who are from out of town, is that while you are here in our beautiful city, to simply spend all your money. So again, have a wonderful, wonderful several hours, and I think that we will all be enlightened as a result of it. Thank you very, very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Robert Sigliano, Director of the Institute of World Affairs, and again, welcome for being here. Thank you, Ben Mehrens. Thank you, Mayor Barrett. And welcome to the 2005 George F. Kennan Forum. Mayor Barrett, Alderman D'Amato said words about George F. Kennan. To me, just a quick word, I think Ambassador Kennan's legacy to us is that ideas matter. His life is a stark example of one person who, with careful analysis, skillful expression, developed ideas that changed the course of history. And in the spirit of informed dialogue and the power of ideas, we're proud to bring you this year's George F. Kennan Forum on the future of the United Nations. Whether you are a UN supporter or a UN critic, I think there are two reasons why this topic is essential. First, as the Bush administration said in its 2002 National Security Strategy, no nation can build a safer, better world alone. So in many ways, the UN is an essential organization to promote multilateral solutions to global problems. Second, from the founding of the UN 60 years ago, the US has remained the country with the biggest say about what the UN is and about what the UN becomes. And we, as Americans, have a vital role to play in helping our government, shaping our government, guiding our government, and how it uses that influence. So we're a vital piece of this debate. And so we're happy to see you here and hope that this serves as the basis for you to take action on into the future. Before introducing our distinguished panel, let me thank our co-sponsors for today's event. Obviously, the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where the Institute of World Affairs is based. The Center for International Education, which is also the base of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM. Wisconsin Public Radio, the UN Association of Wisconsin, the Governor's Commission on the UN, the Mayor's Commission on the UN, the Stanley Foundation, the Annette J. Roberts Fund, and of course, members of the Institute of World Affairs. IWA is a member-driven and financed organization, and we thank our members for their support, and of course encourage you, any of you who are not members, and if you're from out of town and you have some money left over from the restaurants you go to tonight, we hope that you consider joining the Institute. Your support really does mean a difference. You can do this all online. We have a wonderful website, iwa@uwm.edu. I'll give it out several times tonight, so you can remember it. Let me introduce our panel. We're pleased to have Gareth Evans. Gareth is currently the CEO of the International Crisis Group, a leading international organization dedicated to preventing and resolving deadly conflict. It's also celebrating its 10th anniversary, so congratulations, President Evans. Gareth Evans is also the former Foreign Minister of Australia, and recently a member of the UN High-Level Panel on Threats, Challenges, and Change, which released its seminal report on UN reform in December of 2004. It's available online. I encourage you who have the interest to look it up. Gillian Sorensen. Gillian is a senior advisor at the UN Foundation and national advocate on the UN and on the US-UN relationship. Before joining the UN Foundation, Ms. Sorensen worked for 2 UN Secretary Generals. From 1997 to 2003, she was Assistant Secretary General for External Relations for UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. Before that, she was Special Advisor for Public Policy for UN Secretary General Boutros Ghali. Welcome to you both. Now let me turn the event over to our wonderful moderator, Wisconsin Public Radio's Ben Mehrens.
Again, on behalf of all of us here, Gillian and Gareth, thank you so much for being part of the event today. By the way, for those of you at home or in the car listening on Wisconsin Public Radio, we do offer you, as always, the chance to be part of our program at 1-800-486-8655. In Milwaukee, that number is 227-2050, and we'll get to the calls in just a little bit. And we have public radio staff in the audience with microphones, and we'll get to your questions, too. To start us off, and Gillian, you're closest, so we'll start with you. Why should Americans care about and support the United Nations today?
Let me just say, to open, how much I appreciate the chance to come to Milwaukee, to be here at this important gathering, and the honor and privilege it is for me to share a podium with Foreign Minister Gareth Evans, who is an outstanding diplomat and has done remarkable things for the United Nations and for the world at large. Great pleasure to be there. And thanks to the Institute of World Affairs, the UNA, and all the other partners who have organized this event. This year marks 60 years since the birth of the United Nations out of the ashes of war. And American diplomats and political leaders decided at that time, indeed during the war itself, that following that war, it would be different. It would be different from the aftermath of World War I, when the United States retreated and did not join the League of Nations. This time, the U.S. committed to be fully part of this effort, to lead, to actively take part in the creation of the new Organization for Peace. 60 years later, we have the experience of that time. It is, of course, a changed world. It is clear that the UN is an imperfect but indispensable instrument in the world at large, and the United States still has the role, the opportunity that it had from the very beginning to lead, to help set the course, to build coalitions, to find partners, to nurture friendships, to reach out to the rest of the world, and to join forces. And in doing that, America is serving its own national interest as well as the global interest. It is for Americans the best possible way to share the risk, the cost, the burden, the responsibility, as well as the benefit of collective action. It is the best possible way for this country to leverage its influence, to find partners and common ground where we might not expect, even among countries with whom we have political differences, but can begin a relationship on something as basic as children's health or clean water. It is the forum, the United Nations provides the forum for all the world to come together. It is the only universal forum that exists. And it is now, as always, a place of possibilities, of hope and possibilities. That is not to say it's a perfect institution. It could be better, it could be leaner, it could be more effective, but it has now the accumulated experience of 60 years, and that is something we should build upon. Recognize its achievements, address its failures or weaknesses, and proceed from there. Let me very quickly call to your mind a few of these achievements, because we've been so focused and indeed obsessed with Iraq and the controversy around that. But do remember, when you think about the UN, of what I sometimes call the good news that doesn't make news, of the United Nations work on disarmament, nuclear weapons, chemical and biological weapons, small arms and landmines. Remember UN's work on development issues, that is assisting the poorest of the poor. helping them, or helping those who have nothing, less than nothing, to reach a better condition of life. Remember UN's work on election monitoring, the creation of free and fair and democratic elections around the world. Very important role for the UN. Remember UN's work on humanitarian affairs. This year alone, the UN is sheltering and assisting 22 million refugees. Consider that. And recall that the UN was, of course, the leader and the coordinator of the remarkable relief after the tsunami this year. All the non-governmental groups turned to the UN to coordinate that extraordinary effort. And remember UN's work on human rights, not just setting norms and standards as they did in the early years, but putting the spotlight on the worst offenders, calling them to account, seeking the release of those who are unjustly imprisoned, expanding the understanding of human rights to include, of course, women as well as men, even children, and to make sure that human rights is not just the privilege of the free and democratic countries, but the right of everyone on earth. Remember UN's work on reproductive health, safe birth, safe maternity, family planning. Think of UN's work on children's health through UNICEF, on global public health through the World Health Organization. All of this the UN does in a way that no other organization can do because it represents all the earth. Now, it's true that the US is the superpower. It's true we always have a choice. We can go it alone, and sometimes we do. But nearly always we do better when we join forces with the rest of the earth, remembering that we represent just 4% of the population on this earth. And then we come to the last and perhaps the most important area, and that is peace and security. This is difficult. This is controversial. This is the area where the UN has limits in what it can do, and possibilities to do more when there is coherent policy behind it. We'll talk about this more in the course of these 2 hours, but again I submit that the UN represents for this country a very important instrument that we should respect and use well, make the most of it. We look to the future. It is a changed world. The UN will change with it, but I would submit that it's a valuable instrument and one that we should make the most of. Thank you.
Gillian, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, Gareth Evans, the same question. Why should Americans care about and support the United Nations?
Well, thanks, Ben. It's my great pleasure to be here on this platform, sharing it with Gillian Sorensen, who's a pretty class act herself, I have to say. It's also my great pleasure to be here for the first time in my life in Wisconsin and Milwaukee, to the hometown of George Kennan, who was, of course, a gigantically influential and respected statesman throughout the Cold War years, and a wonderful asset to this country and to the world, and certainly to Milwaukee. I want to echo everything that Gillian has said, but perhaps just express it in my own way. I think there are 3 big reasons why the US should be absolutely foursquare behind the UN. The first is because of the very objectives that the UN stands for. Remember them. They're worth etching in stone. First, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, to remove that freedom from fear, if you like. Secondly, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, and the equal rights of men and women, of nations large and small, the freedom to live in dignity. And thirdly, to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom, if you like, freedom from want. They don't strike me as un-American sentiments, un-American values. They're certainly universal. They're certainly values that this country and all its people should want to stand foursquare behind. More specifically, and secondly, quite apart from all the exalted idealism that's associated with the UN, there are very, very good reasons of basic national self-interest for wanting to be part of an effective, functioning, collective security system of the kind that the UN is supposed to represent. It's very much in United States self-interest to have an effective system of international cooperation working to deal effectively with the current threats, the future threats that we are all, and you are all in this country, going to be facing. And I'm referring in particular to the ones that currently worry us most. The threat of terrorism by non-state actors, the threat of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and that material in particular getting into the hands of non-state actors, of terrorists. The threat of international narcotics trafficking and human trafficking and disease spreading that's associated with the failure or the fragility of so many states around the world at the moment. Issues of that kind. We do live in a global village. We do live in an environment which is far more interdependent, far more mobile. People can travel far more quickly and easily than they ever could before. And it's simply the case that in dealing with these kinds of threats, no country, however big, however powerful, can deal with them effectively acting by itself. It needs cooperation in intelligence sharing. It needs cooperation in the application of effective fund tracing. It needs cooperation in policing. It needs cooperation on the high seas. It needs cooperation in every possible way that you can imagine through the institutions that have been created to deliver just exactly that cooperation. The world in many ways was a simpler place in 1945 when the UN was formed. The security threat that everybody was worrying about then was really just of one kind, the threat of nations waging aggressive war against each other, the quintessential threat of the first half of the 20th century. The threats that we are facing now are much more complex, much more insidious, much more linked to the character of this global village in which we now live. And no country, however powerful, I repeat, has the capacity to deal with them by itself. You just do need international institutions, international systems. The third reason is a rather different kind of one, and that is that it's, again, however, in the US self-interest to have out there a system of international law, a system of international rules which everyone observes, governing the use of force, or which they don't observe, there is institutional means internationally available to deal with it. If you don't have that, you do have a system internationally, potentially, of anarchy. Now, there will be those in the US who say, anarchy, what the hell does that matter to us? We are big enough and powerful enough to deal with any direct military threat that anyone might wish to pose against us, whatever weight you attach to all that other stuff about terrorism and WMD and so on. We are big enough and strong enough to deal. We don't need those kinds of rules rejecting the unilateral use of force. If we ever choose to use force internationally, we, by virtue of our tradition, our culture, our constitution, our nature, can be relied on absolutely to do so only for virtuous purposes. So why, therefore, should we feel constrained by this international rule book, this UN system, this interference with our sovereignty, with our freedom of action? Well, I think the short answer to that is maybe you don't need to feel constrained just right now, with the US being as globally dominant as it is. Maybe you don't need to be concerned about, and maybe nobody else needs to be concerned about the use or misuse of American military power. Maybe it will always be used virtuously or for the best possible motives. But things change. Things change. And things that you can't foresee now may in fact happen. We're already beginning to see some changes in the global tectonic plates, the geopolitics of the way the world works. The emerging role of China, not just necessarily as an economic power, but as a geopolitical power, a military power, a strategic power. We are seeing the emergence extraordinarily quickly of India, not just as an also-ran country whose only claim to distinction was being the biggest democracy in the world, but a country that will, before very long, be the biggest country in the world in terms of population, one of the biggest countries in the world economically, and one with the greatest capacity. And there are other countries, and things do change over time. And if you are happy to see the emergence of a world in which the rule book is torn up, in which there are no rules governing the use of force, that might well be a world that turns around and bites you at some time in the future. And I think the best way of characterizing this point, it's the last point I want to make, is to quote something that I heard Bill Clinton say not so long ago, and this is one of the few states in the Union, I guess, where I can quote Bill Clinton without being run out of town. And he said, I think, in a very moving and a very direct and very effective way, making just this point that I want to make. He said, this power of ours, this unprecedented, massive combination of military and economic power, we have a choice as Americans as to the way in which we use that power. We can use it to determinedly stay top dog on the world's global bloc. We can throw all our energy into preserving that position of dominance, of top dog. But there's another choice available to us, and a preferable choice, and that's to use that power in a way that will create a world in which we will be comfortable living when we are no longer top dog on the block. In short, I think that perspective is the right perspective to bring to bear as Americans about your place in the world more generally, but very specifically your place as supporters of a rule-based system of international law, international institutions, dedicated above all else to preserving future generations from the scourge of war, the horror of war, but also dedicated, as Gillian said so succinctly and so well, to those values of human rights and those values of personal development and economic development that are so much part of the American dream as well. Thank you.
Your answer implies a lot of long-range thinking. And when we look back to the beginning of the war against Iraq, it was clear that American sovereignty was not going to be sublimated to the wishes of the UN. How do you foresee the United States or any other nation that has strength, military, economic, and social strength, saying, you know what, we will give up some of that power for the greater global good? The United States obviously did not do that with Iraq, because the first part of my question is, what kind of damage, if any, do you think that did to the UN? And secondarily, how do you see it evolving so that that kind of action wouldn't happen in the future, because a country like the U.S. would bend to the wishes of the UN?
Want to start?
You start.
Well, it has done some damage to the UN. It has created in the UN a rather deep rift between the US and many other countries, including some of our best friends and allies. Obviously, to work with the UN is a choice. It's a commitment. And what I would wish is that that commitment would be to the UN as an organization out of conviction, not just out of convenience. You work with it because you believe in it and because you know it is in the best interests in the long run. You recall in the first war, the Gulf War, the first Iraq War under the first President Bush, that President Bush did make an enormous effort to move through the Security Council, to get that unique legitimacy for action, to build a true coalition, to work with those countries in that war, to share both the cost and the risk in that war. It was very, very different the second time around, when the second President Bush decided to quit and go it alone, to make a coalition of sorts that has mostly fallen away except for the British, and to make that an American war. Now, that is always a choice, but we live with those consequences because it is perceived as an American war, a war with an American face, and the cost in both blood and treasure, that is human lives and dollars, is all American. We could have done it differently. It would have taken more patience. It would have taken more respect and more belief in the reports from the weapons inspectors, who in fact were doing their job and did report accurately. But that requires that you believe in the UN and you work with it and through it. Well, this time we didn't. The rift still exists to some degree. And that is not because countries in the UN, we always say the UN, what we really mean are the member states in the UN. It's not because they hated America. It is because on that point there was a deep difference of opinion. They were not persuaded. We did not put forward compelling evidence that preemptive strike or preventive strike was necessary. And so they stood back. And the U.S. did not persuade 9 out of 15 members of the Security Council that war was necessary. So 2.5 years later, we do live with those results. The cost is very high, I think, and the rift continues. I think it is inevitable that there will be difference of views between the U.S. and the UN over time. That's always been true. There have always been some ups and downs in that relationship, but it is inconceivable that we would step back or step out or dismiss the UN altogether.
Did the U.S. do that by going to war in Iraq and saying we don't believe in the UN?
In a sense, yes, on that issue. It's very easy to say the UN needs the U.S., but I do believe that the U.S. needs the UN also. And I say again that most of the time, nearly all the time, we do best when we work with the organization. So it will take some time. It'll be a matter of years, I think, before that rift is healed. And how do we do that? We come back to the UN. The U.S. comes back to the UN with respect, listening to what the UN can tell us, making use of UN's experience. In fact, it's ironic to me as a UN person for those many years that now the US comes back and says, please help. Please send your best diplomats to help form the governing coalition. Please send your A-team to create the new Iraq. Please send your election monitors to go out in the villages. Please send your people to help train civil police. Please send your people to help reestablish the birth clinics, which have been devastated. Please help us. Now they say it. After all this, you can understand why there is a bit of resentment among UN people, both Secretariat staff and other member nations, when the US comes back as the superpower and in effect demands do this, do that, and acts offended if the UN doesn't jump too. I would suggest that approaching UN, working with UN with more respect, with more evidence of cooperation, would serve us best in the long run.
Thank you.
I'd echo those sentiments again. I think we're going to often find ourselves in furious agreement up here. You better do something about breaking us up before we're out.
Well, I'll tell you what, why don't we have you answer the other part of it, and that is how
I'll come to that. I'll say
sovereign
two
states bend to the will of the UN then?
Yeah, well, just quickly as to the first point, I mean, there is a spectacular contrast as to the way in which the US waged the first and second Gulf Wars. The first was with the consensus and support of the international community. The second one manifestly wasn't. The second one's cost the US a lot of blood, a lot of treasure, and a lot of respect too, I think, not only because of the circumstances in which the war was started and all the questions of evidence and so on that Gillian has referred to, but also the way in which the first stages anyway of the post-war reconstruction and peace building were handled. An awful lot of mistakes were made, I think, by that administration, which I suspect would not have been made if the affairs of the country had been in the hands of a UN transitional administration, quite experienced in the business of post-conflict peace building, with many successful instances over the last 10 or a dozen years behind us. But that's another story. It's happened. We've got to work through it. The question about the impact of all this on the UN's credibility is a very interesting one. And I think from one point of view, the case can certainly be made that the UN and the Security Council did more to preserve its credibility by resisting the pressure to go along with an endorsement of this war when manifestly it didn't believe that the conditions were ripe for doing so, than if it had succumbed to that pressure. It's always a very tough call because clearly any circumstance in which the Security Council is bypassed, any circumstance in which the Security Council is shown to be impotent to stop something happening, or is shown to be wrong-headed in not authorizing it happening, as perhaps was the case in Kosovo in '99, when again the Security Council was bypassed, but in circumstances where there was much more support for the international action taken by the US and the Europeans. Any time, however, for good reason or for bad, that the Security Council has bypassed, there is an inevitable diminution in the credibility of the Security Council as an institution, of the UN as an institution. We can't afford too many more instances of that kind. And that's why it is absolutely critical that in this pivotal year, 2005, where UN reform is so squarely on the international agenda, and we'll be talking about that later in this session, it is absolutely crucial that some serious attention be given to developing agreed criteria for the use of military force when these decisions are being made. It's never going to be easy, even if the criteria are agreed, to agree on their application in particular cases. Never going to be easy when you're dealing with someone who is a manifest tyrant, as Saddam Hussein was. Never going to be easy when there are unresolved suspicions about weapons of mass destruction, unresolved concerns about the risk potential of a particular country. But there is something remarkable in ordinary life, domestically, in national life, and in international life about collective wisdom as compared with going it alone and thinking that you know it all without needing to listen, to consult, to take soundings and to respond to that collectivity. And when you go it alone, when any country goes it alone, or in a small coalition, as was the case on this occasion, there's a very great risk that things will be got fundamentally wrong, and I fear that's what happened on this occasion. I hope it doesn't happen again.
Gareth, thank you. I want to remind people that we'd like to take your questions too. In the back, I can see one microphone is Jackie Carnegie of Wisconsin Public Radio. So if you want to line up behind her, if you've got questions, we'll take them. For those of you listening along, you are listening to the George F. Kennan International Forum presented by the Institute of World Affairs and Wisconsin Public Radio. You can call in with your questions at 800-486-8655 and in Milwaukee 227-2050. And by all means, don't be shy. Last year you asked for more time. We're giving it to you. So if you have questions, please come and ask them. While we wait for people to get off their seats, you talk about the collective wisdom of knowing that we need to operate for the greater good as a global group. But if the rules at the end of the day don't seem to work well for us, whether you're the United States or some other country who has military might, what is to convince that country to go the way of the global good? And you talked about the long-term vision we have to have at the UN. What do you think will change throughout the 21st century to convince other countries to do differently what the U.S. did with Iraq? And Gareth, we'll start with you this time.
Well, I think exactly the same story has to be told to every other country in the world that we're suggesting the US should be listening to. And that is that it's in everyone's self-interest to give away some of that sovereignty, some of that freedom of action for the collective system of a rule-based system and a rule-based set of institutions which will hopefully work effectively, because the alternative is just too horrendous. It's not just a matter of lacking adequate cooperative means to deal with some of these contemporary problems like terrorism and weapons of mass destruction and proliferation that concern us so much. It is a matter of lacking, if the system breaks apart in this way, a capacity to respond effectively when some state breaks the conventions, breaks the norms, breaks the agreed limitations on civilized behavior, and goes out there and goes on a rampage. And we saw what happened when the first try at developing a system of collective security was the League of Nations between the First World War and the Second World War. It was an imperfect system because there was weaknesses in the institutional structures, a dependence upon consensus, which clearly in the real world was not always going to be there. And the biggest weakness of all is that one country said that its sovereignty wasn't going to be compromised in this way. In the US, it stood outside. And as a result of that non-participation, as a result of the inherent weakness of those institutions, those countries in the 30s that were minded to wage aggressive wars felt less and less sense of constraint about doing so. There was no normative constraint, no rules constraint, no institutional constraint. And they went and did their thing. The League of Nations broke down, proved impotent, and we had the Second World War. We learnt from that experience. The very first thing the international community did in the dying days of the Second World War was to reinvent the League of Nations, this time in a hopefully much more effective way. It was to create a rule-based system which would outlaw the use of force except in very narrowly defined self-defense circumstances and except when the Security Council, this new empowered institution, said it was okay. People gave up their sovereignty to a very significant extent. They gave up their freedom of action because they'd just been through a harrowing, awful, catastrophic world war when they saw the implications of those constraints breaking down and disappearing. So that's the basic argument, I guess. You can't just assume continuity in human affairs. You can't just assume that the international system will remain relatively benign and not likely to erupt again in major wars between major countries around the globe. You can't assume that the problems will be confined and localized. You can't make any of those assumptions. You have to work on the basis that if things can go wrong, there's every prospect that at some stage they will. So at the end of the day, that's the story that has to be told to every country in the world. It's not a hard story to tell to little countries like mine, medium-sized countries like mine, Australia. We know that we've got no clout militarily. We know that we've got insufficient clout economically to throw our weight around. We know we have to depend for our protection, our prosperity, our viability on a rule-based international system. It's a little bit harder to tell that story to some other countries that feel a little bit more confident about their own capacity, but at the end of the day, we are all on this planet Earth boat together, and there's every chance that unless we do cooperate, we'll sink together. And that's the lesson of the last century, and that's a lesson I'm afraid we're going to have to learn all over again right now.
Gillian, I'm going to take you off the hook because I want to get some of the people who want to ask
fine.
questions. So thank you for the answer, Gareth. Our first question, state your first name and your question, please.
My name's Larry, and one of the reasons George Bush bypassed the Security Council, right or wrong, was the Security Council didn't follow through on its own resolutions that it passed. I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Well, very quickly on that, the Security Council had decided that the policy of containment, the policy of deterrence, seemed to be working reasonably well. They were unpersuaded that there was evidence that there had been breakout against the terms of those previous resolutions, prohibiting, of course, Iraq from using or retaining or regaining weapons of mass destruction. And they wanted to be sure, before those resolutions were enforced by military action, they wanted to be sure that there was a further detailed, rigorous inspection exercise taking place to satisfy them that there really was a case for taking this action. The Security Council, the majority of members, were simply not persuaded that there'd been sufficiently serious violation of those earlier resolutions to justify going to war. They said, we don't exclude that possibility. It's very important that the Security Council retains the capacity to enforce its own resolutions. It's nonsensical to pass a series of resolutions and then never be willing to enforce them. Maybe the time will come. It's just that the time hasn't come now. And that was the difference between the US and UK on the one hand and the rest of the international community.
I would only say that military force is the last resort. We may have come to that collectively together, but we hadn't reached that point yet, and it required a bit more patience and tenacity than we showed, and perhaps more convincing evidence. As we know now, clearly the evidence of weapons of mass destruction, that is, that there were, was incorrect. That is to say, there were no weapons of mass destruction. We were not in danger of imminent attack, and we might also remember that Iraq had nothing whatsoever to do with the 9/11 attack. Any connection between Iraq and Saddam and the 9/11 terrorists is non-existent. So the premise that was presented was flawed, if not false, and we thought so at the time, and we now know that to be so. So that's important to remember. We have to learn from our history in this, and that informs what happens next time.
We're going to bring a Wisconsin Public Radio listener in and take a phone call from Osseo to talk to Art. Art, He's not. Art's gone. When I went to college in Madison, Art was a window washer, but that was another day. Go down to the floor. Go ahead.
I'm Myrtle, and I'd like to speak of the difference between two different Middle Eastern resolutions. 1559 was for the withdrawal of Syrian troops from Lebanon, which is almost completed forthwith. 242 was for the withdrawal of Israeli troops from the Palestinian territories. Nothing seems to have happened since then. Would you comment, please?
Well, as we see, Syrian troops are now just about out of Lebanon. It's been a long time coming, but it is overdue. It is good that it's happened. We'll hope that Lebanon will have a brighter future. It was a terrible loss that their former prime minister was assassinated a few weeks ago. He was the hope, I think, of the future. But at least they will have their own country back and can proceed accordingly. Israel and Palestine is a complex issue, obviously. We see now the slow withdrawal of the settlements. The Israeli settlements, we'll see if that proceeds. I think it's important that it does. The UN has somewhat stood back from the Middle East conflict, not entirely, but for many years the Americans were the mediator in that complicated issue. More recently, the UN has been part of something called the Quartet. Kofi Annan has participated in those discussions to see if we can move it forward. I get the sense of the Israeli-Palestinian issue like as two people locked in a lethal embrace. They cannot disconnect. They need help to come apart. They need fresh leaders, new vision, new language to move this forward. I don't know if we have a new leader of the Palestinian Authority. We hope he can keep control of things. We'll see. It is time for Israel to pull out of the Palestinian territories, to withdraw some, if not all, the settlements, and to see whether that part of the world has a new chance for peace. It's critical because it has enormous repercussions in the Arab world. This is the Israeli-Palestinian issue is a thorn that prevents many other matters related to the Arab world from moving forward, or to the Muslim world, the larger Muslim world, I could say. So if America can take a very active, constructive, visible role in helping resolve this, it would be a good thing. And I hope that will happen. But let me ask the Foreign Minister what he would say.
That's a pretty good question, because 1559 and 242 do, on the face of it, seem to have had rather competing responses. But I don't think we ought to kid ourselves that it was as a result of the UN's passage of 1559 that Syria has finally withdrawn some time after the passage of that resolution from Lebanon. It was a function of the changing dynamic on the ground, the aftermath of the Hariri assassination, the huge outpouring of popular sentiment, the isolation of Syria, self-generated in many ways by Assad Jr.'s failure to meet the expectations and hopes that many people had of him. So, I mean, it really was sort of a separate dynamic, I think, rather than the UN standing there as the UN that produced the implementation finally of 1559, as much as that was to be desired. Similarly, we have to, I think, wait upon the dynamic to sort itself out for Israeli-Palestinian peace if 242 is to finally be observed. The UN is not going to be in a position itself to enforce that. I just hope to goodness the UN does play itself into a serious role in the current and ongoing peace negotiations, for which the environment does seem rather more hopeful than it has been for a very long time, as a result of the US finally seeing that real leadership is required if this problem is going to be cracked. The Quartet is an appropriate vehicle for exercising that sort of influence. It's just that the standing joke about the Quartet internationally for the last few years has been the Quartet -3, because frankly the other three players other than the US have had no influence whatsoever in terms of the actual movement on the ground. I hope very much that's redressed. We can all only keep our fingers crossed that some sanity and rationality will at last prevail on this situation which has defied both those things for so long.
You're going to leave it there. We're going to get to your question in just a minute. We are trying to be kind to the radio listeners as well. There is a news break that they are going to hear that you are not. You get to ask more questions. So for the people who are listening along, we're going to bring you some National Public Radio news. You are listening to the Kennan Forum on International Affairs, the future of the United Nations. What is it? What it isn't? And at the same time, where the UN and the US stand in the beginning of the 21st century. It's the 60th anniversary year for the United Nations, a make-or-break year, in the words of both our guests, and they'll explain that in the second part of our program. For those listening along at home, the 800 number, including Art and Osseo, 800-486-8655, and we'll try to get to your calls after the news break, and we invite you to dial in now if you'd like. In Milwaukee, that number is 227-2050. The guests you're hearing on the radio and you're looking at, although I assume most of you can see the name tag so you know who they are. Gareth Evans, who was formerly a Prime Minister in Australia and also on the UN's high-level panel on threats, challenges, and change. He's now president of the International Crisis Group based in Brussels, so he's somewhat, I would imagine, jet-lagged, but you're holding up pretty well. We appreciate that. Gillian Sorensen, to my immediate right here, is a senior advisor in the UN Foundation and a former Assistant Secretary General of External Affairs at the United Nations. We are broadcasting live this afternoon from the Pabst Theater in downtown Milwaukee. A few seats open, so if you're in Milwaukee and you want to come down for the second part of the program, we are glad to have you do that. And a reminder, those of you in the audience, at 6 o'clock when we adjourn our discussion, we will adjourn to a reception right behind us outside here, and you're all welcome to stay for that as well. News next here on the Ideas Network. And with that, they've gone to news, and that's just fine. We'll welcome them back in about 8 minutes. And with that, we'll take another question.
Well, there goes my chance at fame, I guess.
Do you want to wait?
My name is Steve. The United Nations, it seems to me, is at a crossroads and probably the most serious crisis, at least since the end of the Cold War. And that is, well, Gareth Evans spoke about a ruthless tyrant and its danger to the world and to the United Nations. We have a person who's like that, or at least has tendencies in that regard. That is George Bush II, who has decided to use naked force as his main form of diplomacy. Gillian Sorensen spoke about going to the United Nations with respect and cooperation, but yet John Bolton has been nominated as the ambassador, a person with a long sordid history, including violation of international law in the Iran-Contra scandal. To nominate such a person really implies what's been spoken of before, that the United States hopes to instrumentalize the United Nations to make it sort of an associate, or one might say a lackey, or have no reason for existence at all. A lot of people in the United States disagree with that, probably many people in this room, and quite a few countries of the world disagree with that. I wonder if our panelists could suggest a way that people like us in this room who are internationalists, who put international cooperation as an important value, could work with other countries, perhaps their delegations in the UN, to somehow save the United Nations from becoming a lackey, whether or not Mr. Bolton is appointed.
Well, first, if you feel strongly about these issues, it is extremely important that you let your representatives in Congress know how you feel, what you care about, know that you vote, know that you're a constituent. Because if they don't hear from you, they may consider that you don't care. And they will vote in some other way. It is, of course, Congress that approves funding, that approves the appointments of ambassadors, and approves the administration's general policies in this regard. So that's very important for them to hear from you. Also, there's a way you can participate in UN activities, and that is through the non-governmental organizations, NGOs. And there are literally 4,200 NGOs accredited to the UN in every area of endeavor, from the environment to the International Criminal Court to issues of health or human rights. And those are easy to locate and to take part in. That is the authentic voice of the people. And sometimes that is heard at headquarters, sometimes it's heard in capitals around the world, sometimes it's heard among citizens like you when NGOs seek to educate, to dramatize, to publicize, to mobilize, to lobby, and to make it known to the leaders of this country and other countries how you feel. That's a powerful force. Some people, this may be exaggerating a little bit, but I've heard NGOs referred to as the other superpower. But when they organize fully, they can do amazing things. It was NGOs who led the fight against landmines. It was NGOs who led the fight for the International Criminal Court, and so on. So there are many ways you can make yourself heard. You can also make every effort to see that the young people in this community here in Milwaukee are learning about the UN, are getting a sense of themselves, not just as proud citizens of Wisconsin, but as international citizens as well, connected to the world at large, caring about the world at large, learning about the world at large. That's how we have a population of young adults who will act and vote and proceed in that spirit. It is true that the president, whoever is president, sets the course, but in this case you see that there is a Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing on the nomination of Mr. Bolton. He is well known at the UN. He is, I must say, a highly intelligent and articulate man, but there are some serious questions because his hostility and disdain of the organization are well known, and his history as a harasser or a bully are increasingly well known. I regret the appointment because if anything is needed now, it's a skillful diplomat, a diplomat who will listen, a diplomat who can persuade, a diplomat who will present the best face of the U.S. in the UN, because that person is day to day the face and voice of America. And it's a very important appointment. It's not a throwaway appointment. So do watch carefully this hearing. There's more to come on this. We'll see if he's nominated. I think perhaps we could do better, and I for one hope that we will.
If John Bolton were just in the business of making the UN a more efficient and effective organization, that's a consummation devoutly to be wished, and we ought to be applauding anything that would produce that result. As I've often said publicly, those of us who love the UN in principle, love multilateral institutions, do them no service by tolerating inefficiency, ineffectiveness, lack of transparency, lack of accountability, a lot of the things that are on the international charge sheet and the American charge sheet at the moment. They've got to be fixed. They must. The trouble with John Bolton, however, is that one suspects that that's not just what he's about, and that he really does have a little bit of a problem with the institution itself, and perhaps would have even more of a problem with it if it was managerially reformed, because he's not in the business of being a great enthusiast for international institutions, international law, international treaties on disarmament or anything else. So it's not the best little bit of imagery internationally, as Gillian has very well said, and not the best possible candidate, I think, in terms of making things happen in that forum itself in New York. The best spin that I can put on this, and it is a slightly more positive way of looking at it, is that if one can leave aside the downside implications internationally in this respect, in US domestic foreign policy terms, maybe what we're seeing here is something of a compromise which actually has resulted in Mr. Bolton being put in a less influential position than might otherwise have been the case. That there's no doubt that the ambassador to the UN is not a policy-making position. Generations of UN ambassadors to the UN have complained about being messenger boys for Washington and not really having any capacity to play an independent role. Some of them have played it notwithstanding, Dick Holbrooke and others come to mind, but nonetheless there are those limitations. And it may just be that the real point of putting Mr. Bolton there was to satisfy various hungry domestic constituencies here in the US who wanted to see some colour and movement and sound and light and drama and angst going on up there, but at the same time without actually seriously influencing the course of foreign policy.
Gareth?
What really mattered, I think, was what's
Gareth?
happening in the State Department.
I have to ask you 1 second.
Yeah.
I just want to welcome back the Wisconsin Public Radio audience who's been listening to the news. You've missed, well, a lot, but, you know, we'll say you can hear it on the website because we'll post this at some point. Gareth Evans and Gillian Sorensen are taking part in this year's Kennan Forum on International Issues, the Future of the United Nations. Those of you, we welcome you back from public radio, and we allow Gareth Evans to continue his answer about John Bolton.
Thanks, Ben. I was in full flight on the subject of John Bolton, as you probably gathered, who's an intriguing character. I mean, you know you've got problems as an administration with someone like Bolton when you see jokes about him or in the international media, the kind that I heard the other night. I mean, when someone was saying, a cleric was saying, well, of course, the Pope, the new Pope, does have a little bit of an image problem out there internationally. In fact, I think of him, he said, as a kind of ecclesiastic version of John Bolton. So without opening up that issue, let me just say about, about John Bolton that you know, if he is there in the business of reform, all and good. If he's there to try and wreck the institution, as may be part of his natural instinct, that's not obviously terribly helpful. But maybe the good way of looking at this is to say that it's not a powerful policy position, although it is a high-profile representational position. And perhaps the more important appointments that have been made by the second Bush administration are those in the State Department itself. And I have to say, I'm much more encouraged as an internationalist about the present composition of the US foreign policy team than I was before. People like Bob Zellick are outstanding, hard-headed realists, people like Nick Burns, number 3. These are positions that John Bolton could well have occupied and presented a totally different picture to the world. So there is a way, I think, of looking at this which is not quite as gloomy, but maybe things will fall out in a different way, the way the politics of this is unfolding, and we'll just have to wait and see.
Gareth, the latest news this afternoon, the headline implied that the Bolton nomination may be in jeopardy. If it's not, and he is put in the position of UN ambassador, is there some benefit for the UN, which has been criticized for various management issues and inabilities, to have a staunch critic from the United States as the UN ambassador?
It's very important for the UN that it does respond to the kind of criticism that it's getting from both critics and enthusiasts for the UN about the quality of the managerial systems in place in the UN. It's important, I think, that that criticism be constructive, that it be helpful, and that it be productive. And that's maybe what's in issue here. But as to the bottom line issue, does this system need to work better? Yes, it does. There's real weaknesses in terms of the way in which the place operates in budgetary and financial terms. The Secretary General of the UN must be the most micromanaged chief executive in the public or private sector anywhere in the world. He cannot shift bodies from one function to another without going to a full committee of effectively the entire UN membership to seek approval. What you need in any organisation like this is the empowerment to respond rationally administratively and then, of course, be fully accountable. But there's a lot to be done on the accountability, the transparency front. So all of these things are important. The credibility of the institution does depend on it. I think all of those things are underway at the moment. The reform momentum is there. And it's entirely appropriate that the pressure for that continued reform come from the US. I just hope that it's productive, not counterproductive, the way in which it operates.
Gillian, you look like you had an answer.
Just a sentence. We fully expect that whoever is ambassador will be entirely committed to reform. There's no disagreement on that. We all know it could be a better institution. And whoever is named will have a lot to do on that. But as Gareth Evans said, it needs to be someone who can work in a constructive way, and it cannot be achieved by the US ordering, commanding the UN to do this and that. It needs to be done by working with other countries to seek consensus, to get a joint commitment to change this and improve that. That's how the UN works. So that's where having a really persuasive and effective US ambassador will make a great difference.
Just a footnote on what Gillian has just said. A very interesting speech made a few days ago by US Assistant Secretary for International Organizations, Kim Holmes, about the US attitude to this whole reform program. He said the following very interesting thing: I believe the United Nations works best when its member states and the United States work together. This requires US leadership.
Right.
Work together, US leadership. I mean, there is a little bit of a problem about just understanding fully the concept of partnership. Working together means partnership. Of course, there are many, many ways, and my organisation is constantly arguing for the US to exert leadership out there on the ground, a lot of conflict situations, which it's been rather indifferent to. But in the context of the basic UN institutional system, what is desperately required is that spirit of partnership, working together, yes, but in a spirit of real equality and mutual respect.
Well, we're going to toss the dice again and see if we have a phone call waiting for us. Pat, if you're still in Neenah, we'll take your call and then we'll come down to you. Pat?
Hi.
Hi, Pat.
Hey, what about non-state actors such as transnational corporations? Could the CEOs of Union Carbide or Unocal be brought before The Hague for manslaughter in Bhopal, or Unical's slavery building the pipeline in Burma? Is that something the UN could do?
Well, there is no global system of justice without making any assumptions at all about the guilt or innocence of particular companies or particular executives. We don't have a system of global governance in that sense, run by the UN or by anyone else. We don't have a system of global justice. The International Court of Justice in The Hague depends entirely on states submitting to its jurisdiction. It has no jurisdiction over individuals or corporates, over anything. The new International Criminal Court that has just been established with less than wholehearted enthusiasm from the United States, but nonetheless has been allowed to operate now in Darfur, which is a critically important first step. That court will have the capacity to operate in situations of atrocity crimes, be they genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. That's not quite the kinds of situations I think that you're contemplating by your question, but it may be a small step towards that greater accountability that arguably we do need if this global community, this global village of ours, is to operate with a sense of justice and a sense that there are remedies for the wrongs that are done. But apart from that, I think we just have to rely on national systems of justice to fill those gaps. And my understanding is that in most of the countries of the world, those systems are developing pretty well, although they certainly need some more support.
Let's go back down to the floor. Your first name and your question, please.
My name is Frank, and I'm a product of the first United Nations war, Korea. I even have a United Nations ribbon on my uniform. I had it. But, you know, John Donne wrote this poem, No Man is an Island. That's the United Nations. A worldwide view that everybody has to cooperate to get together. That's, you know, can you elaborate on the first United Nations war where all these countries got together and South Korea has become a very successful story? This should be elaborated, the success of the United Nations.
Thank you.
I'll just comment on that. The Korean War back in 1950-51 was the one and only example in the United Nations history of the UN itself, blue berets, blue helmets, actually fighting a full-scale war with a full-scale UN mandate, with all the troops participating as UN personnel and under a UN command. Although, of course, the major fighting was done by US-led allies. That happened as a result of a strange circumstance, which you will remember, most of you here, I guess, or will have read about. And that is that at the time the Korean War was authorized, the use of force was authorized, the Soviet Union was boycotting the Security Council because of its unhappiness over a China-Taiwan issue. And in the time that it was away from the Security Council, exercising this show of dignity in the boycott, the other members of the Security Council moved in quickly and endorsed it. That's not a mistake that the Russians ever made subsequently, or any one of the P5 will ever make again. And I think the days on the veto power clearly was exercised every opportunity thereafter when these issues came up. And I think now the common understanding is that the role of the UN is not itself to fight these fights that may need to be fought from time to time. The role of the UN is to authorize the use of force in situations of conscience-shocking violations of common humanity and the Rwanda sort of situations that we all wished they'd intervened in. The role of the UN is certainly to authorize the use of force in situations like the first Gulf War, where everybody acknowledged this was a classic case of cross-border aggression and deserved the full censure and response of the international community. But what the UN has done in these cases, and I think will always now in the future continue to do, is simply authorize others to go to war in that particular way through coalitions of war-fighting countries rather than UN itself. That might be a less than satisfactory solution conceptually, intellectually, in the sense that a lot of people would like the restoration of the Military Staff Commission and the formal military machinery of the UN itself. But I'm afraid that in the real world we inhabit, no major government is going to submit to that kind of control on the ground, the military generalship being done in that particular way, being done by committee, as it were. So I think the Korean War that was fought so wisely and well and so courageously by people like yourself for such a brilliantly just cause was a bit of a one-off so far as the UN's own history is concerned.
If I may just add one note on that, because there's a widespread misperception that there is a UN army. Let me make clear, there's no such thing as a UN army. When the UN undertakes peacekeeping operations, the United Nations has to request, one could even say ask or beg, countries to contribute to volunteer forces who will serve for a time as UN peacekeepers. They wear their national uniforms, they have a blue beret or blue helmet to identify that they're part of the UN peacekeeping force, and in most militaries, UN service is considered a badge of honor. And for a career military person, it's considered a necessary step on their career ladder. I wish that were true here. In any given time, there have never been more than 1% among UN peacekeepers who are American. We simply do not send soldiers. It's too much of a domestic controversy here. But I would add, we do send other things, transport, communications equipment, logistical support, and that is also very important, and it's an essential way to help these peacekeeping operations.
Before you answer, I'm going to throw a question I'd like both of you to answer. Now, should the UN have its own armed forces?
That would never be possible. Member states would not allow the UN to have its own internal UN force. What does make sense, and perhaps Gareth will add to this, is that some countries have offered to have rapid ready forces. That is, it's their own military, but they are trained to a certain common standard, and they're ready to move quickly. If there's a crisis, in 3 days they can be on their way. Not 3 weeks, but 3 days. And since time is often of the essence in these crises, that's very important. The Dutch, I know, have done that, and a number of other countries have that. And to me, I'm not a military person, but to me that seems like a very reasonable and sensible response.
Yeah, I don't think it's realistic. I agree with Gillian to think in terms of a UN army, even just a small, dedicated volunteer force of blue berets, blue helmets available for this rapid reaction role. As much as conceptually we might like it, yearn for it, hope that it was there, wish that it had been available to be deployed in Rwanda, for example, in '94, where 5,000 or so people had been put on the ground with that kind of capacity within a few days of the situation there erupting, we might have saved 800,000 lives, as General Dallaire has made so clear. So while we like the idea, I think the only realistic option is to have this rapid deployment capability in terms of earmarked resources available to move at zero notice once the Security Council has made the decision to go, to green light it. None of these things can be vested as delegated authority to the Secretary General. That's never going to be accepted by any of the member countries. But we can certainly get our act together much, much better when it comes to having that rapid deployability. It's part of the deal for the 21st century to get that one right.
A reminder, we are broadcasting live from the Pabst Theater, and to those of you listening on Wisconsin Public Radio, we're glad you're tuned in to the future of the United Nations, the topic of this year's George F. Kennan Forum on International Issues. Our next question, sir, go right ahead.
I imagine that you folks imagined that you would run into somebody with my opinions during the course of this. I came here 70 miles to hear a discussion, a realistic discussion on the future of the United Nations. Instead, what I have heard for over an hour is a love feast conducted by two members of what I think, two believers in the liberal internationalist paradigm, a paradigm that has been disintegrating for many years. I must say at once, at one time, I also was a believer. But then, to quote Irving Kristol, I was mugged by reality, and I sure hope you folks are. The United Nations is impotent and irrelevant. It is mismanaged, and that all it exists for is as a leash on the American resources and manpower. Right now, they're dancing around Darfur waiting for us to go in and do something about it. I hope President Bush doesn't go in.
Let's leave it there because I want to get some response. And
I would like to say to, I would like to, pardon? My question to you is this. You didn't say that to other people. My question to you is this. Would it not make more sense if the democracies of this world united into a United Nations, since so many, we're outnumbered by the thugs in this world?
Well, that's a point of view that's been widely expressed, and your own point of view more generally has been widely expressed. It's a legitimate one and one we have to respond to. I don't think the notion of a community of democracies being that much more capable of reaching decisions about these things really is very credible. I mean, just think about the transatlantic differences that existed within the community of democracies about the virtue or otherwise of going to war in Iraq, which is the classic case that I presume you would regard as a legitimate exercise of unilateral US power, and entirely appropriate that this nonsensical UN was bypassed. But I mean, if you'd let that kind of decision be made by an organization for which the membership was confined to democracies, you wouldn't have had anything remotely more like consensus than that which you had. So, I mean, recognize that there's going to be weaknesses in any kind of attempt to create a multilateral institutional system. But please, please acknowledge the virtues of having some kind of multilateral system, some kind of rules, some kind of constraints, as compared with the kind of anarchy that would prevail if there were no rules at all, and if it was just left to the mightiest to be able to do their thing. Sorry, I jumped in.
That, sir, is just another mantra. That's another mantra of the paradigm you speak from.
I would add that if you have just a little club of democracies, you ignore the fact that the world changes, that dictatorships become democracies, that authoritarian governments give way to free and democratic governments. We need to keep open that possibility. The United Nations is not an organization of only perfect states. Even our own is possibly not perfect. It is the expression of hope and possibility, and you want everyone there. That's how we learn from each other. That's how we communicate with each other. It is true that the UN cannot do everything, but when it can, it does. When it can make a difference, it does. And many times it is the difference between life and death, between freedom and injustice. And I think we have to be more tenacious, more visionary, more committed. We have to think longer term. We look beyond our borders and beyond the next election and believe that we can create a better world. And it won't happen just by thinking about it and holding hands with the other democracies. We've got to work with those who are not free, with those who long to be free, with those who have needs and desperate needs that we can only imagine. That's leadership at its best. And that's the United Nations opportunity, which exists every day.
Can I just add another word about what this imperfect UN system has actually achieved over the last 15 years since the Cold War ended, despite all the obvious things that have gone wrong, the debacles in Somalia and Rwanda and Srebrenica, and the inability of the UN to get its act together in Kosovo, and then the bypassing of the UN in Iraq. Despite all of that, think of the things that have gone right, starting with the Cambodian peace plan, with which I was much involved in the very early 90s. The truth of the matter is there have been more civil wars resolved by negotiation over the last 15 years than in the previous 200 years. And overwhelmingly, that's been done under UN auspices. There's some figures that are just about to be published which calculate the number of people who've died in violent conflicts in all the years since the early 90s, since the Cold War ended. Throughout the 90s, as these conflicts were working themselves through, we had that horrific spectacle of, in fact, around 200,000 people on average dying each year violently in basically civil conflicts. A lot more people dying from malnutrition and disease as a result of war conditions, but actually dying violently. The figure now, the contrasting figure, in the first 5 years of this century is 20,000. It's been a really quite remarkable plateau drop. And the reason for it, there's a lot of reasons, but an overwhelming reason for it has been the success of a largely UN-based effort in peacemaking, that's effective peace diplomacy, solving those civil wars, resolving them everywhere from north-south in Sudan, and the DRC, although it's fragile, to Angola and so on. It's been as a result of the peacekeeping efforts, some of them conspicuous failures, but many more of them conspicuous successes. And it's been the result of some very successful post-conflict peace building in Bosnia and all over the place, again through UN effort. A lot of mistakes along the way, a lot of imperfections, but basically this stuff has worked. And although it doesn't feel like it, as you look out, as you read the news, as you watch the TV each night, it doesn't feel like the world's getting a better or a safer place. The truth of the matter is there have been some remarkable achievements with all the imperfections of this institution. And let's not forget that when we're weighing these things in the balance sheet, as critics of the UN ask us to do.
Thank you. We bring in another member of our listening audience on public radio this afternoon. Mark in Osseo, are you still there?
Yeah, surprisingly.
Wow, you are there in a big way.
Yeah. I just want, first of all, I want to say how much I appreciate this discussion, and I can't believe there are actually empty seats in that auditorium right now. If I could run over there right now, I would. My question regards the veto power of the permanent members, and what is the likelihood of having that repealed? I appreciate your discussion about having served with the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry under Romeo Dallaire, as a matter of fact, and having just recently read his book, Shake Hands with the Devil. The whole Rwandan affair is very much in the forefront of my mind right now, and it seems to be repeating itself in Darfur. Meanwhile, these permanent members who have the veto power continue to pull their Machiavellian little maneuvers, and people are being slaughtered. Personally, I don't see any, let me address two things. I think the United States would be well served to have more troops in the United Nations and actually serving in these peacekeeping roles to see what good we actually do. Second of all, I'd like to know why we're doing nothing and what chances we have of actually repealing that this veto power these people seem to use at their whim.
Mark, appreciate the call. And if you could answer, both of you answer this question and talk about the discussion of the expansion of the Security Council at the same time. I'd like to get that in.
I think there's absolutely no possibility that the veto power will be abandoned or removed. The permanent five, the United States, Great Britain, France, Russia, and China have had that since 1945, and they're not about to give it up. What may change, and we're looking at this with great interest, is the size and some of the functions of the Security Council. It numbers now 15, the permanent 5 and 10 who serve for 2 years each in rotating seats. And the proposal is that it be enlarged to at least 22 or 24, representing more fully the diversity of the world today and including some of the other major powers, possibly India, Japan, Brazil, perhaps either South Africa or Nigeria. Who did I leave out? And that would add weight, it would add diversity to the Security Council, it would reflect the world today in a more accurate way. But even so, if those major countries come on board, I think there's no chance that the Permanent Five will let go of their exclusive veto power. That's real politics. May not be quite fair, but it is the way it is. I think the new countries may be permanent seats, but without the power of veto. It's a very interesting political debate. Everyone says, yes, Security Council should be enlarged, but then you come to the next question, and that is who, and based on what criteria, and what should be the definition of their role.
Yeah, I agree with Gillian that because the existing veto holders have the right of veto over any change to the Charter, it's a real catch-22. There's no way that they're going to give it up. The veto was the price, after all, of the United States coming into the United Nations system in 1945, and sure as heck is going to be the price of the continuing adherence to the UN by the US, quite apart from any of the others, and I think we just have to live with that reality. What we don't want to do is multiply the idiosyncrasies and problems in principle associated with the veto by giving it to any new member. And I think despite a few grumbles from some of the new potential ascendants to heaven under a reconstructed Security Council about lacking the veto and still being second-class citizens, they will still grab their new seats with alacrity if the international system is prepared to give it to them. There is a remarkable sort of insouciance among the existing P5 about their present exalted status, and a certain sort of confidence that the system will go on and on. After all, if for various political reasons it's impossible to reach agreement about a reconstructed Security Council, I think that confidence is misplaced. The sense is really growing very strongly out there in the wider international community about the extraordinary unrepresentative character of the P5 group, the victors of the Second World War, after all. That's who they are. We don't have Japan, the world's second biggest economy. We don't have India, the world's second biggest population. We don't have anyone from Latin America. We don't have anyone from Africa. They're permanently on the Security Council. And to the extent that that continues to be the case, that organization will be seen as lacking credibility, lacking a willingness of others to support it. So I think the power that's there at the moment, while it's enjoyed very much by the existing power holders, is going to be a diminishing asset over time. And it's pretty critical again that in this year, along with all the other reforms, some significant steps are made to change that particular character of the Security Council.
I'll tell you what, I'm going to hold you there and go down to the floor. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Don from Milwaukee, and I just want to say thanks to the young people for coming here.
Yes.
All the things that we're saying aren't the best, but you're going to get them in 10 years, and we hope this will help you do better. My question is, Gareth, you said that it's in our national self-interest to deal with three problems: terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, and the narcotics traffic. I wonder if you would add nuclear proliferation and explain why it's uniquely better or more possible for the United Nations to deal with nuclear proliferation than with the largest country having nuclear power.
Well, clearly the UN by itself is not going to be able to solve the nuclear proliferation or any proliferation involving chemical or biological weapons as well without the support of the other key players. But the UN is the institutional framework within which these treaties have traditionally been negotiated, and to the extent that we can move forward on things like a fissile material cut-off treaty to stop the production of any more weapons-grade plutonium or highly enriched uranium that's not of a kind that's needed for the energy industry, the extent to which we can negotiate new treaties like that through the UN system, a major step forward will be made. It is a matter of very real concern. The high-level panel of which I was a member identified one of the really big problems out there at the moment as being what we called a cascade of proliferation. We've been remarkably successful in holding the line on that for several decades. Back in the 60s, when the Non-Proliferation Treaty, one of the finest achievements of those Cold War years, was negotiated, back before it was negotiated, and even there was a degree of skepticism at the time, there was a feeling that, you know, within a few years we could have as many as 30 or 40 countries with nuclear weapons capability because the technology was out there, the material was available. But that treaty was fantastically successful in holding the line. What's now happened is it's starting to erode. Eroded, of course, with Israel, first of all, I guess, as an unacknowledged but nonetheless real weapons possessor. Then with India and Pakistan. Now, it seems, as a result of some less than conspicuously successful diplomacy over the last 4 years, North Korea is joined or is about to join the club. And unless we're very careful about the diplomacy that's exerted in Iran, we're going to find ourselves with another problem there. And this is really pretty serious. And we really need all hands to the tiller through the institutional system and through the spirit of international cooperation and effective negotiation strategies shared between countries with common interests that the UN is supposed to be all about. No magic solutions to this one, a long, hard haul, and it's a subject about which I'm actually at the moment very pessimistic. But part of the problem is the erosion of confidence and respect for international treaties. If the US in particular, which has been part of that enterprise, re-engages and re-acknowledges the virtue of having these international treaties, in particular in this weapons area, I think there's a reasonable chance that we can pull ourselves back from that particular brink. But it's going to be a close-run thing. It's a very, very worrying area, and you're right to raise it.
Next question, young man.
I believe it was Gillian who commented before on the fact that not only is the United States necessary to the United Nations, but the United Nations is also necessary to the United States. And I would argue that that is true for every country in this world in both directions. However, you have both expressed your opinions that the veto power will not be given up by the United States or any of the members of the Security Council. So I was wondering how you would suggest that it can be worked around that the countries that aren't members of the Security Council can have more of their say in what goes on in the United Nations as it is the United Nations and not just the United Five of the Security Council.
Right. Well, do be aware that the UN is much, much more than the Security Council. Questions of peace and security are extremely important, but they represent only 20% of UN's work. And every country, all 191 member states, are involved and working on the other whole wide range of issues that I referred to in my opening words. In the humanitarian efforts, in the development efforts, in the global health efforts, all of those that tie us together as one human race. Still, the UN is, I mean, we are realistic. The US is a superpower. It has more access than some. It has obviously a bigger presence, literally a bigger mission and more diplomats there. The US is present on every single committee. But even small countries value the UN, and this is very important. I've seen time and again where a small country such as Singapore or the Netherlands can exert an influence that is larger than life because they are so good at what they do. They make such good choices. They send such fine diplomats. They allocate their energy and involvement in very careful and thoughtful ways. And that is to say the small countries can have an influence. I'm also very aware of what I call the power of personal diplomacy. An individual ambassador who has the intellect, the ability to persuade, the capacity, the energy to reach out, can in himself or herself make a real difference. You've seen that, I'm sure, have you not? Gareth. And that's where in the UN, which is actually a small place, it's one big house and everybody is there every day. So smaller countries, individual diplomats have that chance to make a real difference, to put their experience and their commitments to work and to make change happen. And that's the unique opportunity that lives inside the United Nations. Yes, we need the UN. The UN needs us, that's for certain, and I like to think that the whole world does. It can't be everything. It can't be the perfect solution to all, surely not, but it is an important, a valuable institution for every country.
Just one word. I agree with everything Gillian has said about working around the veto power as it's presently exercised. We're not going to get rid of it formally for the indefinitely foreseeable future, but maybe informally it will be possible to gradually develop conventions about the use of the power only in circumstances where vital national interests are genuinely engaged. Maybe, as was recommended in our high-level panel report, when we're dealing with these catastrophic internal humanitarian intervention, human rights violation situations, maybe it could be possible to develop a convention by agreement that the veto power would not be exercised if there was a majority of members of the Security Council basically in support of taking action in pursuit of what we call the responsibility to protect in those situations. And I think that might just be a productive way forward that will evolve over time. Of course, the cynics would take a slightly different view. If you talk about gentlemen's agreements, there's an Australian Prime Minister who once famously said, and if you'll forgive for 1 second this Antipodean vulgarity, he said, the trouble with gentlemen's agreements, of course, is there's not enough bloody gentlemen. So, you know, we do have a little bit of a problem in terms of delivering on any such agreement that might be hard won. But I think that might just be the way forward as people realise that if we're going to keep the credibility and coherence and respect for the Security Council, it's got to be seen as deploying that veto power, its key permanent members, only very, very cautiously, very, very occasionally.
Let's get at least one more question from the floor right now. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is John. I'm from Milwaukee. And Mr. Evans, you mentioned earlier, spoke of Kosovo in 1999. And of course, that intervention took place during the Clinton administration, not the Bush administration. But notwithstanding the fact that there was, in I think your words, so much more public support for that and support from governments, especially in Europe, why do you think in the Kosovo intervention in 1989, the Security Council was bypassed?
Well, the tragedy of Kosovo 99 was that the Russians basically indicated that through traditional sort of Slavic solidarity and for whatever reasons in the turmoil of the time, that they just were not minded to agree to this and would in fact deploy a veto if the thing came to a vote. That was the constraint with which the Security Council was then wrestling. And that created a really classic dilemma because ethnic cleansing had started to occur. It wasn't occurring in a vacuum. We'd seen over the previous decade an awful lot of these horrors unfolding. There did seem to be pretty strong evidence that it was unfolding all over again. There is a suggestion that had the issue gone to the General Assembly in a rerun of the Uniting for Peace concept, that maybe there would have been a majority there, but that would not have been because of the Islamic states possibly supporting it and a lot of the developing world. But that wouldn't really have been a satisfactory substitute and never can be for Security Council because that doesn't under the Charter formally authorise the use of force anyway. It was a classic example of the legality issue not being satisfied because the formal authorisation was not there from the Security Council, but a number of criteria of legitimacy, of morality, of acceptability probably being satisfied. The issue of last resort, of proportionality, of balance of consequences, and above all, the danger that was being posed to people, real, imminent, and requiring apparently a military response. All those sorts of criteria that we're now arguing should be applied in these cases did seem to be pretty much satisfied. I mean, there'll go on being controversy about it, and one always hopes that for the credibility of the institution, these situations never arise. But I think the damage to the UN system always has to be, weighed of, on the one hand, standing by while indefensible slaughter occurs, as distinct from, on the other hand, bypassing the situation without getting that formal authority. This was an instance in which, on balance, I think the right thing was done. I just, wish it had been done with the authority of the Security Council, because the precedent had been created for a situation in which was infinitely less international consensus a few years later, with obviously the Iraq situation, where again, of course, it was being claimed that there was a response to a catastrophic internal human rights situation. The trouble was the real violations had been 10 years earlier. They weren't occurring in real time. So there are problems when you break these rules, but the Kosovo case is one that I think on balance we can live with, provided it doesn't happen again.
We have about 2.5 minutes for each of you to answer this last question. For those of you who didn't get your questions in, we will wrap up and adjourn right outside. You'll get to talk to the guests and be able to ask your questions. But we talked before we went on the air and got into the theater, and both of you talked about the 60th anniversary being a crucial year, a make-or-break year, you both said, for the UN, for specific changes you thought had to take place. You can't mention all of them, but give us each about 2 minutes of some of the thoughts you think we need to see changed in the UN. And Gillian, why don't we start with you?
Well, the reform report is in place now. It's out at the to the member governments. They will consider this, and in the fall when they come in, it includes a bold new vision for collective security. It talks about prevention and development efforts as part of that. It talks about counterterrorism strategies, about strengthening the non-proliferation regimes. It talks about changes inside the UN Secretariat, in the General Assembly, in the Economic and Social Council. It talks about strengthening the Secretary General's role. I wish it had talked more a bit about the personnel system inside the UN. I've always considered that was a weak link and needed attention. It has over 100 recommendations, or it did at the outset. This reform report is really key. The time is now, the moment is here. There's a window of opportunity. I hope that governments will not pick it apart. It will die, how do they say, die from 1,000 cuts if that happens. If this is the chance for the UN to be renewed and reformed for the 21st century, and I hope we will seize that. The one other side of the importance of this year is the Millennium Development Goals. That is the targets to assist, to reuse the phrase I said earlier, the poorest of the poor, those billion people on earth who have nothing. It talks about eradicating poverty, achieving primary education, clean water, maternal health, birthing and safe birth and safe maternity, and combating AIDS. These are fundamental issues that will help the countries that are at the absolute bottom of the scale in terms of development. If these two things, the reform report and the Millennium Development Goals, can have real progress, real momentum this year, then I think we see a UN that is strengthened and renewed and revived in very important ways for the century to come.
Gillian, thank you very much. Gareth?
I really do believe that 2005 is a make or break year for the UN, the whole international collective multilateral system. It's been under huge stress, huge strain, not only through the internal problems, the oil for food issue, accountability issues, management issues, but the stress posed by the fundamental challenge to the whole premise of the current system by unilateral action, by those going outside the UN system and using force, and not, in many cases, even acknowledging the primacy, the critical need for observance of international law and international rules. As Kofi Annan said a couple of years ago, we've come to a fork in the road in terms of the international system, the UN. We either act now to reinforce its credibility in the whole rule-based system, or we run the risk of that system disintegrating and all the anarchy that's associated with us. Of course, I think it was Casey Stengel of New York Yankees once famously said, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. Well, unfortunately, we don't have that luxury of having it both ways. We are going to have to make some very hard choices this year. And this year is a year in which this can move forward. We all understand, I think, everyone in the international community, the need for change, the need for reform, as a result of all these things that have been going wrong and everything that's been said. We've got an agenda for fixing those things. We've got an agenda for reform. Gillian spelt it out. We've got it in the Sachs report on the Millennium Development Goals. We've got it in the high-level panel report, which has been consolidated into a brilliantly succinct report from the Secretary-General himself, outlining a very detailed, substantive agenda addressing all these three areas: freedom from fear, the security issues; freedom from want, the development issues; and freedom to live in dignity, the human rights issues. We've got that agenda. And we've got the opportunity for that agenda being implemented with this 60th anniversary year, with all the summitry, all the conferences, all the commitments that are supposed to go with it. What is missing is that spark of political will, that real leadership that is always necessary to make these things happen. For one fleeting moment with the tsunami, I thought optimistically, perhaps naively, that that political will was going to be there this year because of that demonstration we all had with the tsunami, that we really were one human family, that we did share common risks in this globally transporting itself internationally community, that things didn't just happen to people out there, they happened to all of us, and that sense of common risk and the common responsibility to deal with it. These things, unfortunately, however, fade, memories fade, things move on. But the message is there, that we just have to display that same kind of spirit. The truth of the matter is that we really don't have any alternative. Either we fix the UN system and we take the opportunity that this year presents to do it, or we run the risk of finding ourselves back where we were in the 1930s, with all the horror of what happened after the League of Nations collapsed and when we had to reinvent an international collective security system all over again. So let's start with what we have. For the sake of our sanity, for the sake of our survival, for the sake of our kids' survival, let's take the opportunity of 2005 to really make reform of the UN system something that does happen. And that's the responsibility not just of political leaders, but of publics in all the democracies of the world where your voices can be heard. And I hope the voices of you here tonight, who seem to be overwhelmingly in favour of what we're talking about and the need for this kind of change, I hope that your voice will be heard too. It's a critically important year. It's critically important that this be the year of change.
Garrett and Gillian, thank you both very, very much.
Well, let me say, oh, don't leave yet. We're not done with you. Let me say, on behalf of the Institute of World Affairs, our University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, our PAPS Theater audience, our Wisconsin Public Radio listening audience, I want to thank you, Ben Mehrens, Gareth Evans, Gillian Sorensen, for a great 2005 Kennan Forum on the United Nations. Thank you. I think as our discussion went to, the issue here is not reforming the UN for the purpose of reforming the UN. We have to figure out what is our challenge, what do we do in this critical year, and what role do we, the United States, play in that? As part of the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, IWA wants to encourage you to learn more about this issue. There's a free backgrounder on the UN on our website, iwa.uwm.edu. You can also order a reader on the UN that IWA produced with the publication Foreign Affairs. I want to draw everybody's attention to the Kennan Memorial Fund, an effort being led by sculptor Elmer Peterson with the support of Alderman Mike D'Amato to raise funds for a monument in honor of George F. Kennan. You can contact the Institute. Let me say thanks again to our guests, our co-sponsors. In addition to those I thanked earlier, I want to recognize Milwaukee Public Television, which will air the Kennan Forum, also airs our weekly television show International Focus at 5 on Sundays. I want to thank the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, Midwest Airlines, and of course the Center for International Education at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Lastly, let me thanks to you, our IWA members, all of you here at the PAPS, all of you on the WPR listening audience. May you continue to be engaged with this issue and engage with others as we think about the future shape of the United Nations. Ben, back to you.
Rob, thank you very much. And some of the round of applause should be for all of you. Give it to yourselves again for taking the time to have this discussion. And for those of you up in the second row, second balcony, you definitely deserve a round of applause for coming. Be careful unhooking your seat belts before you get up. A couple of people I'd want to take a minute to thank from Wisconsin Public Radio: Bill Estes, Peter Donalds, Lisa Nalbandian, Jackie Carnegie, and Mimi Notstein all helped put this broadcast on the radio while you were here in the Pabst Theater. Our engineering was done by Marv Nunn and Dave Shank. Marv came all the way from Madison to help today. Thank you, Marvin. Bob Zanoni and the staff members here at the Pabst Theater make this possible and relatively painless for public radio to put on. We thank them as well. And we certainly thank the UW-Milwaukee's Institute of World Affairs for making Wisconsin Public Radio a partner with the Kennan Forum. Rob Rosigliano, Susan Yelich-Binyetsky, Rachel Schrag, thank you all very much. But mostly, we thank you for continuing this discussion here in the Pabst Theater, outside in the next 15, 30 minutes if you stick around and can talk with our guests today. And when we continue these discussions on international affairs on Wisconsin Public Radio, I hope you'll tune in and I hope you'll call in so we can have your input. This dialogue is crucial, whatever you think about the UN or any international issue we talk about. Gareth Evans and Gillian Sorensen, you both traveled a long way and gave us the benefit of your wisdom and knowledge. Again, whether you agree or disagree, it's important we discuss it. And we thank you both very much for taking the time to be here today. One other reminder while we get ready to sign off the Wisconsin Public Radio audience, and that is for any of you who care to hear this forum again, it will be archived at WPR.org. Or if someone you know would like to hear it, we keep it online for up to a year, and we also sell copies through our radio store. But we hope that you'll tune in to future programs with public radio and public television for International Focus on Sunday afternoons, and that you'll take part in the Institute of World Affairs classes and lectures and discussions as you see fit for your value. Again, on behalf of Public Radio and the Institute of World Affairs, I'm Ben Marins, and I thank you all so much for being here.